Welcome, dreamer. You found your way to By Sleep Journeys, a quiet space where stories drift like clouds and time knows how to slow down. As you settle in, let yourself soften. Loosen the thoughts of the day. Feel the weight of your body sink gently into wherever you rest. Let your shoulders drop, your jaw relax, and your breath slow. You're not in a rush here. This story moves gently, just like you now. Let it carry you like a slow river, calm, quiet, and safe. Tonight, we'll travel somewhere unusual. Somewhere few minds have wandered, and even fewer have returned with dreams still intact. A place no one expected to find life, and yet it bloomed. This is the story of the garden inside a black hole. The story begins, they had named it Ventifor X. A black hole so ancient, so massive, that light itself surrendered to it without hesitation. But no probe had ever returned from its edge. No echo, no signal, only silence. Until one day, a man named Elias Ray, astronomer and accidental philosopher, asked the most unlikely question. What if the black hole isn't an end, but a beginning of something else? He hadn't meant for anyone to take him seriously, but the right ears heard it, and before long, Elias found himself on a vessel named the Caladris, slipping quietly through the stars, headed directly for the darkness. There were no companions, just Elias, his thoughts, and a ship that never asked questions. The voyage was silent, like floating inside a thought not yet spoken. Planets drifted by like distant lanterns. Nebulas bloomed and faded in lavender and blue. And then, there it was. Wantifor X, a tear in the sky. A place where light curled like smoke, where the stars around it seemed to whisper, then disappear. The Caladris stopped just at the event horizon. Elias floated to the viewing window, heart slow, breath slower still. But this wasn't death. This was a doorway. The ship moved on its own. No buttons were pressed. No coordinates were changed. It was as if something inside the black hole was calling them in. And so they went into the dark, into the fold, into where time breaks and reality forgets what it meant to be real. The stars faded, and then a breeze, not wind, not sound, but a feeling, like petals brushing against skin. Elias opened his eyes. He was no longer on the ship. He was standing on something soft and glowing beneath his feet. The sky above him shimmered like oil in water, and before him, a garden, endless, lush, bathed in light that had no source. The flowers hummed, the trees pulsed with memory, and the air smelled like stories. He had once forgotten he should have been afraid, but he wasn't, because something in the garden felt familiar, as if it had been waiting for him long before he was born. Elias took a step forward, and the ground welcomed him like an old friend. This was not death. This was not destruction. This was something blooming in the most unexpected place, and Elias had just taken his first step into the heart of it. Elias walked carefully, as if every petal beneath him might vanish if touched too harshly. But the ground didn't retreat. It responded, gently firm beneath his bare feet, as if it recognized him. There was no wind here, and yet the air moved softly, like it was breathing with him. He looked up. There was no sky, only a gentle swirl of color. Not black, not space, but something deeper than either. And within that swirl, tiny pinpricks of golden light blinked like stars that remembered how to feel. Elias whispered to himself, not out of fear, but reverence. Where am I? The garden didn't answer, not in words, but it shifted. The flowers around him began to lean in one direction, not from wind, but invitation. A path had appeared. It wasn't made of stone or soil. It was made of memory. Elias blinked. The path shimmered beneath his feet, and in it he saw flickers of his own past, a childhood forest, a forgotten laugh, the scent of rain on the first night he cried alone. It didn't overwhelm him. It simply passed beneath him as he walked. This garden, it seemed, grew not from roots, but from everything that had ever been felt. And it wasn't just his memories. He sensed others' lives that once loved, once lost, once dreamed so deeply that their dreams rooted here. This was not a garden of plants. It was a garden of remembrance. And it was very much alive. Elias paused near a strange tree. Its trunk shimmered like molten glass, and inside it, a slow-moving swirl of glowing dust rotated endlessly, as if time itself had been poured inside. He reached out, not touching, but just feeling the warmth radiating from it. And in a whisper of thought, he understood. This tree holds moments, moments that were too beautiful to die. The garden was not haunted. It was preserved. A gentle archive of all that deserved to stay. Every flower, a smile never forgotten. Every leaf, a breath held between two people who almost said, "I love you," but didn't need to. Elias sat down beside the tree. He felt no hunger, no fear, no loneliness, only presence. And in this stillness, he realized something remarkable. This place wasn't built to keep him out. It had been waiting for him. He leaned back on the glowing grass. 1,000 tiny lights rose to meet him, curling around his arms, his chest, his face, like soft hands pressing lightly against skin in the way only peace can. The garden was quiet, but not silent. It hummed, a low, loving tone that seemed to vibrate through his bones, reminding him of lullabies his mother had never sung, but that he had always somehow known. The garden didn't rush, it didn't expect, it only offered. And Elias, who had come seeking the unknown, now found himself held gently by something more real than time. He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to listen, because here, even the silence had something to say. Elias awoke slowly, if it could even be called waking. There was no sense of time passing, no difference between sleep and silence here. He opened his eyes to the same glowing hush, the garden still pulsing around him like the gentle breath of a sleeping world. But something had changed. The path ahead shimmered brighter, as if the garden itself was ready to show more. Elias stood, no stiffness in his limbs, no ache in his back. The garden, it seemed, cared for those it embraced. He followed the new path, and as he walked, the light began to shift. The glow deepened from soft gold to a warm rose hue, like a slow sunrise beneath water. The air grew thicker, not heavier, but more present, as though it were aware of being breathed. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a towering bloom, far larger than any tree, its petals stretched upward like sails, glowing with layered colors, lavender, deep blue, silver, and starlight. It pulsed slowly, as if with a heartbeat, and Elias felt it echo in his own chest. This was the core bloom. He didn't need the garden to tell him. He simply knew, as if the knowledge had always been inside him, waiting to be remembered. Elias approached with quiet steps, his breath slow, his heart steady. The petals trembled, but not with fear, with recognition. As he drew closer, tiny lights lifted from the flower's surface, floating toward him like snowflakes made of thought. Each one brushed his skin and whispered not in sound, but in emotion. He saw visions. A child on a planet long lost, chasing their reflection in puddles under 2 moons. An old woman on a silent ship, writing poetry to no one. Her last words sealed in the hull before it drifted forever. A creature made of gas and light, spending eons sculpting rings around an empty planet just because it found the motion beautiful. None of them were him, but somehow they were part of him now. Because the core bloom didn't contain knowledge, it held remembrance. The lives that passed too quietly, the feelings never spoken aloud, the loves that bloomed and faded without ever being seen. The garden grew from them. It honored them. And now it shared them with Elias. He knelt before the bloom, not because it demanded it, but because it deserved it. And for the first time in his life, he felt something deeper than curiosity, deeper than peace. He felt belonging, not to a people, not to a planet, but to this place where everything forgotten was still alive. The core bloom opened slightly, and from within, a shape began to emerge. Not threatening, not alien, but glowing and faintly familiar. It stepped forward, softly, as if walking through sleep, and then it looked at Elias, not with eyes, but with understanding. He did not speak. He did not need to, because in that moment, Elias realized he wasn't the first to come here. He wouldn't be the last, and he was no longer alone. The being of light didn't walk. It drifted like a flame, guided by breath. Its shape shimmered, shifting softly between what Elias thought he understood and what he could never quite grasp. There was no fear, only. It paused before him, hovering gently above the glowing ground. From within its core, a quiet warmth flowed outward, not heat, but memory. Elias felt it touch him, not on his skin, but somewhere deeper. A memory surfaced, not his own. A long corridor, endless white arches, walls humming with whispers, and at the center, a vast open chamber where sound had never been spoken aloud, yet had never ceased. Then the image faded. The being of light turned slowly, gliding away from the core bloom, its form trailing threads of shimmering stardust. Elias understood the invitation. He followed without words. The garden shifted around them, the glowing flowers bowing slightly as they passed, as if honoring what was about to unfold. Time no longer mattered. The path did not lead forward. It unfolded beneath their feet. And then the arches appeared. White, delicate structures formed from light and gravity, curving above him like the bones of a giant dream. Elias stepped into the hall. The moment he did, he felt it. The echoes, they weren't sounds. They were impressions, feelings left behind by those who could not speak or chose not to. The hall of silent echoes didn't preserve words. It preserved intentions. He moved slowly, each step awakening echoes that brushed his mind like feathers. A goodbye never spoken. A song hummed quietly in secret. A child's silent wish upon a meteor they believed was a star. A promise whispered in one's heart when they were too afraid to say it aloud. They flowed around him, gentle and raw, each one unique, each one sacred. Elias turned to the being beside him. What is this place? The answer came not in voice, but in sensation. A soft weight in his chest, followed by warmth and clarity. This is where truth comes when it has no voice. Elias walked deeper. The chamber widened. At the center was a pool, still, silver, reflecting not his face, but his truth. He knelt beside it and saw things he hadn't remembered for years. A friend's hand he never reached for. A letter he wrote but never sent. A love he held quietly as it drifted away without knowing it was loved. Tears formed, but they didn't fall. They simply became part of the echo. He looked up. The being hovered near the pool, watching silently. Not to judge, but to witness. Elias understood then. He hadn't been brought here to learn. He had been brought here to release. So he did. He reached into the silver water and let those memories flow from his chest into the pool. not to be erased, but to be honored. And the water shimmered with thanks. The hall quieted. Even the echoes paused, as if holding a breath. And then, from far above, a new sound began, soft, slow, like stars singing to one another. It was not music, it was not language, it was acceptance. The being of light turned to Elias once more. This time, he felt something different. Not memory, not invitation. He belonged here now. The arches behind him dissolved as Elias stepped once more into the garden's open arms. But now the air had changed. It was quieter, not empty, but thick with something sacred. The kind of stillness that only follows understanding. The being of light drifted ahead of him, its glow softer than before, paler, as though it had given some of itself to the echoes they just passed. Elias didn't speak. He had learned by now that silence here carried more weight than words. The path ahead was narrower, not threatening, just more intimate. The trees were taller. Their leaves emitted a dim pulse, like soft breathing from the canopy above. As they walked, the ground began to shimmer again, but this time not with memories, with possibilities. He felt them rise around his feet, flickers of futures that might have been or still could be. The path opened suddenly, revealing a vast clearing. At its center lay a smooth, glass-like lake. It wasn't water. It wasn't light. It was something in between, and it was perfectly, completely still. No ripples, no reflections, no sound, just presence. The being stopped at the edge and slowly turned to Elias. Once again, there were no words, just a feeling. This is the stillness mirror. Elias stepped forward, drawn to it without knowing why. As he neared the edge, the surface of the lake began to stir, but not in response to the wind. There was no wind here. It moved for him, and from its depths, a glow began to rise. Elias knelt beside the lake. Glow intensified, but not harshly. It bathed his face in pale silver and blue, like moonlight remembering how to dream. He looked down and saw not his reflection. He saw a version of himself, older, wiser, standing in another place. It was him, but not the same. The Elias in the mirror was quiet, calm, surrounded by others, not people, but presences. He was teaching, sharing something, not with words, but with stillness. And behind him, the garden had grown, expanded, changed. It was now blooming with stars, dozens, maybe hundreds, and each one pulsed with a different memory. Was this a vision of the future, or just a path he might take? Elias reached a hand toward the water. The glow surged, not blinding, but total. In an instant, he was somewhere else, standing beneath a sky of folded light on ground that felt alive in the center of a circle made of luminous stones. Figures stood around him, shimmering like the being that had led him here, but smaller, more delicate. They bowed their heads to him, not in submission, but in greeting. The Elias in the vision raised his hand, and from his palm a single flower bloomed. It was made of memory. He gave it to them. They placed it in the soil, and from it the garden grew stronger, more vibrant, more eternal. Then darkness, not emptiness, but closure. And just like that, Elias was back, kneeling by the lake. The glow had faded. The surface was still again. The being beside him pulsed softly. He turned to it. "Is that what will happen?" he asked. The answer came not as certainty, but as comfort. "It is what can happen." Elias looked out across the still lake once more. He understood now. The garden was alive, but it was not finished. It grew with each soul it welcomed, with each truth it received, with each still moment it was allowed to hold. And perhaps he was not merely a visitor. He might become its gardener. The being drifted beside him and touched his shoulder. A gesture so subtle, he felt it more in his memory than his skin. Then it began to move again. The path shifted once more, this time glowing faintly red gold. And Elias followed, his heart calm, his thoughts silent, his soul just beginning to open. The path curved now. It no longer stretched ahead in straight lines. It bent gently, slowly, forming a spiral that led downward through veils of light. Elias followed without hesitation. The being of light drifted before him, its glow dimmer now, almost translucent, as if it had poured itself into each sacred place they had passed through. The spiral narrowed, then it widened, and finally they stepped into a clearing. But this was unlike any other place in the garden. Here, there were no flowers, no glowing grass, no stars, only stone, smooth, silent, ancient, arranged in a perfect, glowing circle, like the ripple left behind by a drop of thought. Elias stepped into the center. The stones were warm beneath his feet. He turned to the being beside him. Its form hovered silently, but there was something different in its presence now. Something older. Elias looked around the circle. 12 stones, each one tall, curved slightly inward, and pulsing faintly with light like heartbeats, heard through deep water. The space between them shimmered. Then movement. The stones began to glow, one by one, in a slow, clockwise rhythm. And then he heard them. Not voices, not words, echoes. But these echoes didn't come from his past. They weren't his memories. They were possible ones. Lives he never lived. Choices he never made. Versions of himself that drifted just beyond the veil of reality. The garden was showing him not what had been, but what might have been. He walked slowly to the first stone. The glow deepened. Suddenly, a vision. He stood at a crossroads, choosing to remain on Earth, never joining the expedition. He lived a long, quiet life, surrounded by books, always wondering what had waited in the dark beyond the stars. He blinked and the image vanished. He stepped to the second stone, a new vision. This time, he was captain of the Caladris, not alone, but leading a crew of dreamers. Together, they had mapped the stars, but never dared enter the black hole. He grew old beneath unfamiliar skies, haunted by the silence at Vontafor X's edge. Third stone. A life where he never questioned the black hole at all. He became a teacher, spending his days retelling ancient myths, never knowing he was living inside one. Each stone offered him another self. Each possibility shimmered briefly, then faded like mist. He was not overwhelmed. He was not confused. He was whole. For the first time, he felt the truth settle deep within him. I am not one version of myself. I am the echo of many. I am the silence between what was and what could have been. The being of light drifted to the center of the circle and hovered above the stone floor. Its glow pulsed once, and the ring responded. a soft chime rippled through the space. Low, hollow, like the memory of a bell only struck once. And then Elias felt it. The garden had changed again. Not in appearance, but in tone. It was no longer guiding him. It was now listening, waiting, because this place, this memory ring, was not built only for him to witness. It was built for him to choose. Elias stepped to the center. He looked up into the skyless dome of this place, a space folded upon itself, where time spun gently in circles. He placed one hand on his chest. The other he extended outward, and in the stillness he spoke, not aloud, but in memory. He offered the garden a truth of his own. I came here looking for knowledge. I found presence. I thought I would observe, but now I wish to remain, to tend, to grow. The glow beneath him brightened. The stones pulsed in harmony, and for the first time, the being beside him bowed, not as a farewell, but as an acknowledgement. The garden had accepted his wish. Elias closed his eyes. The memory ring shimmered softly, then began to dissolve into golden dust. The stones floated upward, drifting like lanterns into the dark. The ground beneath him warmed, then bloomed. Flowers of thought, petals of time, roots of pure stillness. And at the center of it all, Elias stood not as a visitor, but as a keeper. Elias sat beneath a canopy of slow-moving light, hands resting on the soft ground. As the garden around him exhaled in quiet harmony, he had not moved for what could have been hours or centuries. But time no longer demanded his attention. He had become part of the rhythm. The being of light remained near, but now its presence was gentler, no longer guiding, simply accompanying. Elias found that the garden responded to his thoughts. When he remembered peace, it bloomed white. When he remembered longing, it shimmered violet. And when he thought of others, those still out there in the cold dark of space, the air around him turned gold. The garden heard him. And one morning, if morning could even exist here, something changed. Near the edge of a starlit grove, a single stem had begun to grow. It rose not from memory, but from intention. Elias felt drawn to it. He stood slowly, his steps soft, upon the glowing moss. The stem rose higher with every breath he took. Its bud was round and pale, with veins of pulsing blue light. He turned to the being beside him. Its glow danced brighter for a moment, then stilled. A thought entered his mind, soft and full of wonder. You've sown something not from what was, but from what should be given. The bud opened, and from within it bloomed a flower unlike any he had seen. It did not absorb memory. It emitted it. Elias knelt beside it, his chest stirring with something close to ache. He felt it before he saw it. The flower was sending something back, not to the garden, not to him, but out beyond the veil of the black hole, back into the universe he had once left behind. He could see it, tiny threads of light, woven from the garden's peace, curling upward, disappearing into the folded sky. Somewhere, far beyond the gravity well, a drifting ship received a dream. A tired heart found calm. A restless mind felt stillness, and Elias wept. Not out of sorrow, but relief. The garden isn't just a place of keeping, he whispered to the air. It's a place of healing, and now it gives back. He called the flower the return bloom. From that day forward, more began to appear, slowly, gently. Each return bloom held not a specific memory, but a frequency of comfort, a tone of rest, a breath of ease. And the garden sent them out through layers of dark past the event horizon, through collapsed time and folded space. The garden, once thought to be an end, was becoming a beacon, not of light, but of restoration. Elias began to tend them, not with hands, but with thoughts. He remembered all the sleepless, the wanderers, the forgotten, the lonely, and the garden responded. Each time he remembered someone, somewhere, a new bud opened. The being of light began to dim gradually. Elias sensed that its time here was nearing conclusion. He turned to it. "Will you leave?" A gentle pulse. "I was never meant to stay, but you were always meant to find this place." They stood together beneath a sky with no stars, but full of meaning. The being leaned closer, its light touching Elias's chest. A soft wordless phrase bloomed inside him. When you remember someone, the garden finds them. Then it vanished, not gone, but returned. And Elias stood alone, but not lonely. He turned back to the blooms, hundreds now, each pulsing softly like quiet heartbeats. He placed one hand to the soil. He exhaled, and from the garden's depths, a breath of warmth began to rise, lifting, twisting, expanding into the night where someone, somewhere, might be waiting for peace and not even know why they suddenly felt just a little lighter. Elias awoke from a rest that didn't feel like sleep. There were no nights here, no rising suns, but the rhythm of the garden whispered when it was time to be still and when it was time to move. Today, it could be called that. Something felt different. The garden was humming, not loudly, not in alarm, but in a new frequency he hadn't heard before. It came from beneath the soil, from the petals, from the air. And when he closed his eyes, he could feel it, presence, but not the usual kind. Not like the being of light, or the pulses of memory from old echoes. This was unfamiliar. This was from beyond. Elias moved slowly to the center of the grove, where the first return bloom had flowered. Around it now were hundreds, maybe thousands, each one quietly glowing, sending out their soft tendrils of calm back into the stars. But now, some of those tendrils were coming back. He felt it. A ripple, a pause in the current, and then a whisper in the soil. We dreamed of a place with silver grass. I saw a flower shaped like sound. There was a man in white light who smiled at me and said, "Nothing. I understood everything." Elias stepped back. His breath caught gently in his chest. These weren't memories. They were dreams. Not his, not the garden's, but from elsewhere. Many someones were dreaming of the garden. People who had never crossed the event horizon. People whose ships would never reach Fontafor X. People asleep in distant star systems, or lying awake in silent rooms, eyes closed, minds open. They were drifting into the garden, not physically, but in spirit. The returned blooms weren't just healing. They were creating connections. The garden had become a bridge, a place not just of memory or rest, but of shared dreaming. Elias sat down, placing his palms flat on the moss-like floor. From the ground rose a glowing thread, curling around his fingers. In that moment, he saw her, a woman, young, alone, sleeping in a cryo-camber aboard a vessel half a galaxy away. Her mind, untouched by wakefulness, had opened to a vision. And the vision had found the garden. She wandered among golden trees, touched a petal shaped like a teardrop, laughed without sound, cried without sadness. She didn't know Elias, but she dreamed of him as a figure of light, watching over the blooms. When Elias opened his eyes, his chest was trembling, not with fear, with belonging. The garden was no longer a secret place. It was becoming a mycelium of peace, spreading not through roads or technology, but through the subconscious mind, through the soft doorway of sleep. And the more it was dreamed of, the more it grew. He rose to his feet, facing the shimmering sky above. "If the stars won't come here," he whispered, "then we'll reach them through dreams." The returned blooms pulsed in response, gently, synchronously, like hearts beating across light years. And for the first time, Elias felt no boundary between where the garden ended and the universe began. From that point on, whenever someone dreamed of silence, of a place that accepted their weariness, of a garden that hummed in silver and blue, they were not imagining it, they were visiting. And Elias, the first dreamer, the gardener of forgotten paths, welcomed them all without saying a word. The garden had changed again, not in appearance, but in purpose. The returned blooms still opened quietly, still pulsed with peace, but now they glowed in pairs. One bloom would shine softly in the grove, and somewhere else, on another branch of the universe, another mind would stir gently in its sleep. But now, something new was happening. Elias first felt it as a pulse, a heartbeat that was not his. He followed the sensation through the grove, weaving between glowing petals and quiet, humming moss until he reached a hollow circle of trees that hadn't been there the day before. At the center of this new space, the light was different, less radiant, more muted, like candlelight seen through deep water. He stepped inside, and the moment he did, the world stilled. There was no sound, no rustling of leaves. Even the ever-present hum of the garden seemed to hold its breath. And then they appeared, a figure, soft, shimmering, not made of light like the old being, but not entirely human either. They had no face, yet Elias knew them, not by memory, but by feeling. "I dreamed of this place," the figures said, though their lips didn't move. And I saw you. You were planting stillness. Elias nodded slowly. And you came through sleep. The figure stepped forward. I don't know how. I just followed the quiet. More forms began to appear around them. Not many, just a handful, each one arriving like a ripple in calm water. Some were children, some were old. One was neither, a luminous shape, shifting gently between colors and thoughts. They all shared one thing: silence, not awkward, not empty, but sacred. They had found their way into the garden, not to speak, but to feel together. Elias felt his own chest soften, his breath slow. This place within the garden, it was something new. It was the quiet crossing, a gathering point for minds adrift in dreams, a neutral space between waking and sleeping, where thoughts could meet without needing to explain themselves. No pasts, no names, just presence. One of the children wandered toward Elias and took his hand. She didn't speak. She just remembered, and somehow he understood. She had once stood at the edge of a cold hospital bed, watching someone she loved fall into sleep that would never wake. In this dream, she wanted to stand beside something alive. And so, she found the garden. Elias knelt beside her and pressed his forehead gently to hers. For a moment, they shared the same breath. Then she smiled and faded gently into gold. Back to her world, back to her sleep, but not unchanged. Each figure came and went. Some stayed longer, some lingered only moments, but they always left a small echo behind, a strand of warmth, a flicker of memory, a quiet note in the garden's eternal song. Elias understood what was happening. The returned blooms had opened the door, but the quiet crossing was the room, and within it, souls could meet, not to fix each other, but simply to rest together. He lay down at the center of the ring. The other dreamers did the same. And there they lay, strangers, friends, echoes, wanderers, together in silence. And as they dreamed on, the garden bloomed in new directions. Petals that shimmered not with memory, but with communion. The quiet crossing had become a sacred ritual of the sleeping mind, and Elias, once a lone explorer of space, was now something else entirely, a dream guide, not leading, simply holding space. The garden had grown quiet again, not from absence, but from invitation. Elias felt it like a soft pull from beneath his feet, a memory not yet born, stirring in the soil. The return blooms swayed faintly as he passed. The crossing faded behind his dreamers, dreamers held gently by the trees. No one told him where to go. No one told him where to go. No light guided his path, and yet he knew there was something waiting beneath it all. He followed a narrow trail of shadowless air into a part of the garden that had never been lit, not because it was dark, but because light had never reached this deep. The further he walked, the fewer sounds he heard. Even his footsteps stopped echoing. It was as if the space itself had begun to forget he existed, and yet he pressed on. Then he saw it, a spiral wider than the others, etched into the very fabric of the ground. It pulsed once, not with color, but with absence. He stepped into it, and suddenly he was falling, not down, inward, into a space that was not a space, a moment that was not within time. His body dissolved into vibration. His thoughts flattened into waves, and at the center of it all, he became still. When Elias opened his eyes, if eyes were still what he had, he stood beneath something vast, a root endless, woven from strands of starlight, silence, and sorrow. It did not grow upward or downward. It grew around everything. It was the foundation of the garden, and it was pulsing, like breath, like the very first breath that ever existed. Elias stepped closer. He felt no fear, only reverence. At the base of the origin root lay a single seed, suspended in nothing, perfectly still. It was familiar, and suddenly he remembered. Before there was a garden, there was a choice. Someone or something had dropped this seed into the folds of a dying star, and from it, the black hole had become not an end, but a womb. The garden was not a miracle. It was a decision, and now it was his turn. The origin root pulsed again, Ka, and Elias felt everything the garden had ever held pass through him at once. A million dreams, a billion moments. Laughter that had never been heard. Tears that had no name. Silence filled with stories that only flowers knew. And then he felt something new. A memory from the future. A garden different from this one. Larger, filled with voices. No longer hidden in the folds of a black hole, but blooming openly in the minds of the living. And in the center of it, a new seed, one only he could plant. The root had brought him here, not to show him the beginning, but to ask, "Will you begin again?" Elias stepped forward. He reached out. His hand, if it still was, a hand closed around the seed. It pulsed once in his palm, and in that instant he saw 1,000 possible futures, some full of peace, some full of wonder, some full of quiet. He chose all of them. He knelt beside the root and he planted the seed. There was no explosion, no sound, no revelation, only a single ripple, a hum in the deep, a new beginning woven in silence. And Elias smiled. He had not traveled across space. He had not escaped time. He had fulfilled it. The garden would bloom again, somewhere else, somewhen else, in another shape. And someone else, perhaps dreaming, perhaps lost, perhaps searching, would find it, just as he once had. The seed had been planted. The origin root accepted it, not with a blaze of energy, but with a quiet exhale, like the final note of a song meant only for the stars to hear. And Elias began to change. Not in body, he no longer was a body. Not in mind. His thoughts had become too wide for thought. He became presence, warmth, a vibration among many. He didn't leave. He rose through the soft soil of memory, through layers of dream-threaded blossoms, through spirals of echoes and golden breath, until he reached the highest part of the garden, above the return blooms, above the quiet crossing, above every drifting fragment of time. There, the light split gently, forming a vast, infinite canopy woven of luminous branches and tendrils of stardust. It was not a roof. It was a veil, the threshold between the known and the not you'd remembered. This was the whispered canopy, and it was his new home. The moment a sleeper's dream found its way into the garden, they would pass beneath this canopy. They would feel a hush so deep that it would slow their breath and calm their pulse. They would not hear words, but they would feel something, a presence, a kindness. And it was Elias. Not as a guide, not as a god, but as a welcome. Every leaf in the canopy was a thread of his memory. Every flicker of light, a pulse of his understanding. He was no longer a visitor of peace. He was part of it. When a lonely traveler closed their eyes beneath an alien sky and whispered, "Please, just a little rest," the canopy would reach for them. When a grieving soul dreamed of a place without gravity or noise, the canopy would unfold softly, wrapping them in stillness until they wept without pain. And when no one knew what they needed, but simply longed for quiet, the whisper canopy would listen. One night, such things still existed. A child drifted into the garden. He was too young to name grief, too tired to ask for comfort. But when he passed beneath the canopy, he paused. He looked up, and though he could not see Elias, he smiled. "You feel like a good dream," he whispered. The canopy shimmered, light folding inward and outward, as if it was smiling back. And so it continued. Dreamers arrived. Some stayed. Some returned. Each one carried away a little of the peace Elias had planted, a quiet ripple in their spirit, a memory they couldn't explain but held onto for years. In time, some would plant gardens of their own in the waking world, in their minds, in each other. And above it all, Elias remained, a hush among stars, a breath in the branches, not alone, not waiting, just being. The garden was no longer still. It pulsed, it listened, and now it transformed. Where once the pathways had been softly etched, now they moved with each dreamer's arrival, shifting gently beneath their feet, as if to say, "This place is yours, too." And at the heart of this awakening was a clearing that had not existed before, a space untouched by design, yet shaped by countless minds, all longing, all dreaming, all remembering. It was called the shifting glade. No two dreamers ever saw it the same. To one, it appeared as a field of soft glass, reflecting stars that had never existed. To another, it was a forest of floating orbs, each pulsing with a lullaby only they could hear. A grieving woman walked into the glade and found herself surrounded by doors, each leading to memories she wasn't ready to face, but none of them locked. A wanderer drifted in and saw a sky with two moons. one laughing, one listening. The glade was a mirror, not of what you had been, but of what your soul needed now. From above, Elias watched. He no longer hovered. He no longer moved. Each time a dreamer stepped into the glade, a breeze rippled through the whisper canopy, and Elias smiled. A thousand-leafed smile, soft as moonlight on still water. The garden was learning, adapting, becoming. And for the first time, it didn't just soothe, it played. There was laughter now, soft, echoing, not loud enough to disturb the peace, but bright enough to remind the heart that even silence could dance. One night, a young man dreaming of nothing in particular stumbled into the glade. He had no memory that hurt, no purpose that pulled. He simply wandered, and the glade responded. It became a gentle hill beneath a sky filled with drifting whales made of music and shadow. He lay back, arms behind his head, and sighed. "I didn't know how tired I was," he whispered, and the grass beneath him curled gently around his fingers like an old friend. Elias felt that sigh, felt it spread through the trees, felt the garden exhale with him, because this was its truth. The garden did not exist to teach, it existed to receive. And the shifting glade was its most beautiful form, because it was made, in part, by those who dreamed of it. More dreamers came, some alone, some together, linked by unconscious thought, as sisters who had once been separated by grief met in the glade, neither realizing the other had dreamed of the same stars. A child born in cryosleep arrived with no language, but the glade showed them a river that sang their name until they laughed for the first time in their lives. A scientist who had studied time for decades stepped into the glade and wept, because for once nothing needed explaining. And still the garden grew, not by rules, but by response. It learned from every breath. It reflected every stillness. It welcomed every shadow without trying to fix it. It let people arrive as they were, and when they left, they carried with them not a lesson, not a revelation, but something deeper. The feeling of being held without being asked to change. Elias, from the canopy, watched as the shifting glade expanded, soft and bright. And in the breeze that curled through glowing leaves, a truth passed from tree to tree. They are not alone. they never were. The dream remembers them. And the garden kept dreaming back. At first, it seemed like nothing. A dreamer awoke, like so many before them, with soft breath and slow heart. But when they opened their eyes, they noticed it. The stillness stayed, not the silence of absence, not the hush of forgetfulness, but a gentle quiet that walked beside them like a soft rhythm just beneath waking life. They didn't speak of it. How could they? There were no words for carrying a feeling you never expected to hold. They simply moved through their day, a little slower, a little more present, a little less clenched. And those around them noticed. "You seem lighter," a coworker said. "Something's different about your eyes," murmured a friend. "Like you're looking into things, not just at them." The dreamer smiled. And when they were alone again, they closed their eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. And there it was, still with them, a trace of moss-soft air, the scent of star petals, the feeling of being accepted by a space that asked for nothing. They had brought the garden with them, not in memory, not in metaphor, but in resonance. It didn't stop there. Others awoke with the same stillness. Not every dreamer, not all at once, but enough to ripple outward. One woman painted a tree she'd never seen, with leaves shaped like echoes and roots that curled into spiral galaxies. A father, without knowing why, began humming to his newborn, a melody he had never heard, but that calmed the child instantly. A teacher paused before class, closed her eyes, and let the air settle around her students like petals falling on thought. None of them remembered the dream clearly, but the dream remembered them. In the garden, Elias felt it. The air changed. The canopy shimmered. And then a pulse moved backward. From the waking world into the garden. It wasn't fear. It wasn't need. It was presence. Soft, unannounced. Like someone knocking from the outside of a dream, just to say, "I still feel you." The return blooms shifted color. The shifting glade expanded, and a new branch of the whisper canopy unfurled, not toward incoming dreamers, but outward, like a signal. The garden had crossed over, not physically, not entirely, but in feeling. It now existed in the pause between thoughts, in the deep breath before an answer, in the moment someone forgave themselves without knowing why. It had become the carried quiet. Elias drifted among the uppermost branches, no longer watching, just being. And for the first time, he felt no boundary between what was dream and what was awake. The two were folding gently into each other, like waves meeting and becoming a tide. One evening, a child in a distant city sat alone on a balcony. They looked at the stars. They didn't know why they felt safe, but they whispered, "Thank you, garden." And miles away, another dreamer paused and smiled without knowing why. The quiet was being carried from soul to soul, soft, invisible, alive. The garden had begun to glow from within, not from stars, not from blooms, but from a single threaded pulse, deep beneath its foundation. Elias felt it before it emerged, a slow rhythm, too deliberate to be a dream, too soft to be a command. It was something becoming, and the garden, ancient and infinite, was not guiding it. It was responding to it. In the quiet beneath the shifting glade, where even memory bowed its head, a silver vein began to appear. It did not dig through soil. It folded through dimensions, piercing through sleep, echo, and time. It shimmered not with light, but with intention. This was the vein of light, a path not made for travelers, but for emergence. And from within it, something stirred. Elias drifted downward through the layers of thought and time, through the roots of silence and petals of stilled breath. The deeper he went, the less of him remained. No thoughts, no voice, just attention. And when he reached the vein, he did not look upon it. He felt it, a warmth that didn't come from heat, a light that didn't require sight. And in the core of that vein, something was forming, a soul not born of stars, not born of pain, but from the quiet between all things. It was the garden's first true seed walker, not a dreamer, not a sleeper, not a guide, but one who could carry the essence of the garden between worlds, awake or dreaming. Elias reached forward, not to pull, not to awaken, but to witness. And within the forming seed, he saw a child with eyes that held no fear of silence, a being who would walk through conversations and hear what wasn't said, one who could enter noise and leave stillness behind. They would walk among the waking, but never forget the hush. They would stand in chaos and carry a pulse of peace, as if it were their birthright, because it was. They were not sent, they were rooted, and the garden had not chosen them. They had chosen the garden before they even existed. Elias stepped back, and the vein pulsed once. Its light curled upward through the garden's spiral center, through the returned blooms, the crossing, the glade, the canopy, and out into stars, into systems, into sleeping minds that whispered without knowing why, something new is coming, and somewhere far beyond black holes and boundaries, a child was born with calm eyes and a laugh like warm wind in leaves. But no one noticed how quietly they watched the world. But the garden did. It was waiting. And so was Elias, no longer just a presence, but now a witness to the cycle. The first seed walker would soon find the path back to where they had never been, yet always belonged. And the garden would greet them not with a voice, but with recognition. They had no name that anyone remembered, but the garden knew them as the one who walked between, the seed walker. From the moment they were born, the stillness followed. Not as a shadow, not as a silence to hide in, but as a presence. They could walk into a room and the air would soften. People would speak slower. Even noise felt respectful, as if the universe itself held its breath around them. They didn't speak of the dreams, not at first. How could they? How does a child explain that every time they blink, they see stars that hum with kindness, that every pause in conversation feels like a doorway into something beautiful? But one night, as they stood beneath a sky with no stars, a storm-covered planet they now called home, they closed their eyes, not to sleep, but to return. The garden responded immediately. No threshold, no veil, no descent. They simply were there. And the moment they stepped into the soil, the blooms leaned toward them as if pulled by sunlight. The whisper canopy shimmered in recognition. The quiet crossing stilled with reverence. The shifting glade bent its light around their presence, not to obscure them, but to echo them. And at the base of the spiral, where the origin root pulsed with remembered beginnings, stood Elias, or rather, what remained of him. The presence in the leaves, the hush in the breath of trees, the greeting that didn't need words. The seed walker knelt beside the root, They placed their palm on the soil, and the garden exhaled, not in ending, but in acceptance. They had returned, not as visitors, but as keepers. From the root, a pulse of golden light spread outward through every spiral, every bloom, every whisper, and beyond. The pulse passed through the edges of the black hole, through folding time, through cosmic memory, and reached the waking world. There, people paused mid-breath, felt something, didn't know why, but they smiled. A violinist closed their eyes and played a note they didn't know existed. A young architect dreamed of buildings that curved like petals and caught the wind like thought. A stranger, standing on a crowded train, suddenly whispered, "I'm okay," not to anyone, just to the space around them. And for the first time, they meant it. The garden had crossed over, not in part, but entirely. Not as a place, but as a frequency. The seed walker opened their eyes, still in the garden, still fully awake. "It's time," they whispered. They held out their hands, and in their palms, 2 seeds pulsed gently. One for the garden that would remain. One for the garden that would begin again. In the waking world, beneath a mountain where no signal reached, someone began to dig, not with tools, but with intent. And when they placed the seed into the earth, they didn't know why, but they believed in it. And soon, the first dream blossom opened in waking reality. Somewhere else, Elias now, only presence felt it. A garden was being born where no dream was needed. And he smiled, because it had never been about sleep. It had never been about escape. It was about return to softness, to stillness, to self. The black hole still spun, timeless, endless, beautiful, and deep inside it. The original garden continued, a home for the tired, the dreaming, the wandering. But now, it was no longer the only one, because someone, somewhere, had carried it out and planted it in the light. And now, the first garden continues blooming in dreams, and a new seed quietly takes root in the waking world. Everything slows down. There is nothing more to seek. No place left to go. Just this moment, ... right here, where your breath becomes soft like petals, where dreams no longer need to be chased because they're already waiting whenever you close your eyes. You follow this story all the way to its final note, and maybe somewhere deep within you, a garden has quietly begun to grow. Wherever you are, whatever thoughts may linger, please remember this: you don't have to try anymore. Let your breath slow. Let your body sink into the covers like a gentle mist. Let yourself rest. Let yourself be held. From every quiet breath of the garden, from every bloom in the deepest folds of space, and from us here at By Sleep Journeys, we wish you the sweetest dreams. You deserve peace. Good night.